Back about a lifetime ago, I was a youth minister for 17 and a half years, and that half year needs to be counted. Honestly, there were things about youth ministry that were perfect for me. And there were things about youth ministry that were really challenging for me. I guess the bottom line is that's kind of the way life is, isn't it? Well, one of the things that I got to do was to take care of, be in charge of, and frankly, most of the time, be the only adult in the room at what we called junior church. Now, if you would have had to have been in churches 40 years ago for that term to mean anything to you, but basically, it was kind of a hybrid between taking care of the kids, elementary school age kids, so that they wouldn't be disturbing the adults in, big church, and giving the kids a meaningful experience during church time. And I opted for that. So the way it worked for me was I was also in charge of the music. So I was up in big church leading the music, and then once offering and communion were over, I'd run down the stairs to the basement where we had junior church, and I would do the junior church thing, which was after a while it was natural, it was normal. And but one of the things I enjoyed about junior church was that my teaching was all about storytelling, because I realized you don't teach kids much theology unless you tell them stories. And so I loved telling stories. Most of the stories would come out of all the narratives. All the stories came out of the narratives of the Bible, okay? And just because of the issue of volume, the number of stories, the Old Testament has tons and tons and tons and tons of stories. The New Testament in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the book of Acts, those are all stories, narratives. True, but still narratives told in story form. One of the stories that I enjoyed telling is a story that Peter references here in 2 Peter chapter 2. We're in verse 15. He keeps giving kind of similes. They are, here's the unrighteous, that last time we talked, we realized that this is in the context of the church. This is not just the world. These unrighteous people, he says they're an accursed brood. And then he says, they have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer. Now, Balaam has a pretty darn interesting story from the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. Balaam was a prophet, and in the narrative from the book of Numbers, he is not a Jewish prophet. He's not a part of Israel, and yet somehow he seems to be a believer. Whether he was to what degree or extent, I don't know, a believer in God. Well, here's the thing. Balak was a king and back in those, this is way back in the BC days, and there were few nations as we today think about nations. There were more cities and kingdoms. Okay, well, Balak was the king of a kingdom and was watching the approaching hordes of Israel, which I think I've expressed this before, but in my opinion, the most conservative figure that I would be able to give to the number of Israelites that were traveling through the wilderness led by a cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. Moses at the lead as the human leader. Well, there were 650,000 men of fighting age, okay? In that culture, if you were of fighting age, the odds were heavily favored that you would be married. And if you were married, heavily favored that you would have kids. And if you had kids, you would certainly have more than one. Okay, but if we say that a family unit was just three, mom, dad, one child, that's a tremendously understated, conservative number. But if extrapolate that out, 650,000 men and their families, you get, I don't see how you could get less than 1.5 million people. And if you add one or two more kids to the family units, you get somewhere between 2 and 4.5 million people. So this was not just, a little, string of people in the wilderness. This was like an overwhelming horde. And Balak was overwhelmed. And so he contacts Balaam and says, come and curse these people. Well, Balaam says, well, I'll come, but I can't do anything except what God tells me to do. I mean, I won't be able to utter anything except what God tells me to do. Okay, Balak says, it's worth a try. So they go up to a high spot where they can look down and see the hordes. Well, before they go, actually the story begins with Balak contacting Balaam and Balaam being hesitant. And then finally he says, okay. Well, he gets on his donkey and riding in response to this invitation. And they come to a spot where there's a wall on one side and bushes on the other, and the donkey scrunches up against the wall and smashes Balaam's leg, and this makes him angry. And this happens more than once. And Balaam, he spanks the donkey. And finally, the donkey just sits down in the roadway. Balaam gets off and is ready to thrash the animal. And then the donkey speaks and says, What are you doing? Have I ever done anything that would lead you to believe that have I ever disobeyed you? Have I ever not done what you've directed me to do? What's going on here? And then Balaam's eyes are open, and there is an angel with a drawn sword in the pathway. Well, that would get my attention. I don't know about you. And there was not very much dialogue between Balaam and the angel, and one of the reasons is when in ancient times, if you saw an angel, you didn't go, wow, how cool is this? I got to get this on my Facebook page. No, you were frightened out of your mind. But this brief interchange between Balaam and the angel creates a scenario where it is reinforced to Balaam. Okay, you go, but you don't say anything other than what God tells you to say. Okay, so they go on, and as I said, they go to a high spot, and they look down and see the hordes of Israel. Balaam says, give me a minute, and he begins to listen, and God gives him what amounts to a prophecy for prosperity. And he speaks this prophecy of prosperity over Israel. And Balak, of course, is hearing this and going, that's not what I got. You were supposed to curse these people. Balaam said, I can only do what the Lord tells me to do. Okay. Balak says, all right, let's drop back and punt. We got to do something here. So they go to another place, and it's very difficult for us to relate to this, but I believe one of the reasons why it happened this way is because ancient religions were founded on superstition. And some of the superstition was geography based, which seems silly and dumb to us, but that's just the fact, Jack. So they went to another high place where the hordes and throngs of Israel can be seen. And Balak says, now curse these people. And you may have already figured out, if you know the story, you know Balaam couldn't curse them. He blessed them. All of the failures of this idea of cursing Israel failed. And yet there is one trick that Balaam knew and had up his sleeve. It was this. Take your most, and this is a paraphrase on my behalf, take your most beautiful, seductive women and seduce Israelite men. They are seducible, and your women are beautiful, and you can infiltrate them in this way. And as a result of that, you will be able to curse them as you hope. It's bizarre, but that's what happened. Well, Peter writes, they have left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Bezer, who loved the wages of wickedness. Wow. Now, okay, quickly, just a brief little thing. We've got at least two Old Testament references from Peter here. And remember back, the first one was to Lot. And Peter calls Lot a righteous man who was tormented in his righteous soul by the sin of the people in his city, Sodom. Now we've got Balaam, the son of Bezer, and that would be, I don't know, about 1,000 years later, who loved the wages of wickedness. But he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, an animal without speech, who spoke with a human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. I look at Balaam and think, well, I don't know. I have to say this about Balaam. I mean, he was up front with Balak and said, I can only do and say what God gives me to do and say. When Balak said, I want you to curse these people, Balaam at least had the honesty to say, well, I'll give it my best shot, but I can't guarantee that a curse will come of it. And sure enough, where he could have perhaps spoken a curse, he spoke a blessing. Well, okay, that to me doesn't quite equal wickedness. That's not what Peter is referring to. I believe what Peter is referring to is the outcome. The outcome was that Balak and his people followed this advice of Balaam, and they did seduce Israelite men with beautiful women and introduced into the Israelite camp paganism. And in any form, that's wicked. Well, the story of Balaam's donkey, in the Old King James Version, it is Balaam's ass, which as a kid, can I just tell you, that always cracked me up. Well, there is this other saying, when this is for preachers, don't get too excited about yourself, because if you did what you think is a good sermon, don't ever forget that God spoke through an ass at another time, and he might have spoken through you as well. Well, Balaam. We'll pick it up there next time. I hope we get to connect.